Peter never believed in fate, but he had to admit that life had a twisted sense of humor. One minute, he was a happily married man, content in his quiet, predictable world. The next, he was standing in the middle of his garage, staring at something that made absolutely no sense. It wasn't a lipstick-stained collar, a secret text message, or any of the tired, cliché nonsense you'd expect in a story like this. No, Peter's first clue came in the form of a list. A perfectly typed, bullet-pointed list tucked inside the glove compartment of his wife's car. Now, Peter wasn't the type to snoop. He didn't go rifling through Ruth's things like some paranoid sitcom husband. But that morning, he'd gone out to grab his golf clubs from her trunk, since his car was in the shop. He'd opened the glove compartment to check for a stray scorecard and, instead, found a printed document with the title, Things to Remember. That alone was weird. Ruth wasn't a list person. She was a leave sticky notes all over the house and then forget about them person. Intrigued, Peter unfolded the paper and read. Always park 2 streets away. Keep the receipts, return everything after. Delete messages immediately. Wear something neutral, not red. Red is noticeable. If asked, say late meeting Wednesday or drinks with Rachel Friday. Peter doesn't notice details. Peter blinked at that last one. He reread it. Peter doesn't notice details. Well, that was just rude. He sat there for a solid minute, letting the words settle, as a slow, sarcastic smirk spread across his face. Oh, come on. This had to be a joke, right? Some ridiculous work thing? An inside gag between Ruth and her friends? Because there was absolutely no way his wife was fool enough to write a literal how-to guide for sneaking around and then just leave it in the car like a fool, right? He checked the back of the page. Blank. No company logo. No sign that it was some kind of corporate memo. Just a single sheet of paper, detailing exactly how his wife had been lying to him. Peter let out a slow breath, tapping the page against the dashboard. Now, a normal man might have gone inside, confronted Ruth, demanded answers. But Peter had never been a normal man. No, Peter believed in handling things with style. So, instead of making a scene, he took a deep breath, folded the list neatly, and put it back exactly where he found it. Because this wasn't just an affair. This was a game. And now, Peter was playing too. That night he acted completely normal. He didn't mention the list. Didn't let a single thing slip. He laughed at Ruth's stories, nodded along to her complaints about her coworkers, even made his usual sarcastic comments when she tried to convince him that kale was actually really good this time. But in the back of his mind, the list was there. Peter doesn't notice details. Well, Peter noticed now. He noticed the way Ruth's phone stayed face down on the table, even though she usually couldn't go 10 minutes without checking it. He noticed the new coat hanging by the door neutral, not red. He noticed how, when she said she had dinner plans with Rachel that Friday, she over-explained, listing every single dish they supposedly ordered. Oh, Ruth. Sweet, oblivious Ruth. Peter wasn't angry. Not yet. No, at this stage, he was just fascinated. Because the thing about Ruth was, she wasn't the impulsive, reckless type. She planned everything, thought everything through. She was meticulous, except, apparently, when it came to not leaving detailed evidence of her cheating in her own car. That part still baffled him. So, who was she cheating with? Peter wasn't a detective, but he figured there were only a few possibilities. It had to be someone local, since she wasn't suddenly taking mysterious work trips. Probably someone who also had a reason to be sneaky. A coworker? A neighbor? Someone from her gym? He was almost curious. Like a man watching a magician perform a bad trick, just waiting for the moment the wires and hidden compartments became obvious. But first, he needed proof. Real proof. So, Peter started making his own list. Things to do. Keep acting normal. Forget something in her car again. Check glove compartment. Follow Ruth on a Wednesday. Find out who Rachel really is. Do not, under any circumstances, let her know what's coming. Because now, it was his turn to have some fun. Peter was never a particularly sneaky guy. He wasn't the type to read over someone's shoulder, eavesdrop, or memorize people's schedules like some obsessed weirdo. But when your wife left behind a literal cheat sheet for lying to you, well, at some point, it became your civic duty to see how deep the stupidity ran. So, he followed the list. On Wednesday, Ruth said she had a late meeting. A classic excuse, and according to her very own printed instructions, one of her go-to alibis. Peter had no reason to be home early that day, which worked perfectly for his new hobby, catching his wife being an absolute moron. Instead of going to work like a responsible adult, Peter left an hour late, then turned his car around as soon as he was out of their neighborhood. He parked down the street from their house and waited. At 9:15 a.m., Ruth left for work, completely unaware that her husband was already out ruining his own mental health. Peter gave her a head start, then followed at a safe distance. He half expected her to be extra cautious, check her mirrors, take a weird route. But no. She just drove like she always did, completely comfortable in the knowledge that Peter was, in her words, a man who doesn't notice details. She arrived at work exactly on time. Peter waited. At 6:32 p.m., Ruth walked out of the building, not alone. She was laughing too much, in the way people laugh when they need it to be clear they're just so happy, so relaxed, so definitely not hiding anything at all. And next to her, looking just as suspiciously casual, was none other than Darren Wallace. Peter stared at the guy like a detective in an old crime show. Darren. Freaking. Wallace. Of all people. Let's be clear, Darren wasn't some James Bond type. No, Darren was an accountant. A divorced, painfully boring man whose greatest accomplishment in life was knowing an insane amount about grilling equipment. Peter sat back in his car, processing. So, this was the guy? Darren? The human equivalent of watching paint dry? This was almost offensive. Ruth and Darren got into separate cars, but Peter was already too invested to let it go. He followed. Darren drove across town and pulled into a strip mall parking lot. Ruth showed up 5 minutes later. A strip mall. Peter let his head hit the steering wheel. He had prepared for a dramatic discovery. A private apartment, some secret hideout, at least a better location than a parking lot next to a discount shoe store. Ruth parked and got into Darren's car. Peter stared. That was it? No sneaking around? No hesitation? Just walk out of work and immediately jump into Darren's Honda like a casual Wednesday routine? They sat there, talking, like this was some weird suburban stakeout. Peter grabbed his phone and zoomed in. He couldn't hear anything, but Ruth was smiling. Darren looked serious, nodding along. After 10 minutes, Ruth got out and left. Peter watched Darren sit in his car for a full 5 more minutes, staring straight ahead like some haunted man. And then finally, he drove off. Peter had questions. The next day, Peter took a different approach. He was willing to be patient, but he also knew Ruth well enough to know that if you gave her too much credit, you'd end up disappointed. So when she left for work, Peter didn't tail her. He went into their house and checked the one place Ruth would never expect him to look. Her desk. Ruth wasn't the best at hiding things. She never locked drawers, never worried about privacy, because Peter doesn't notice details. Except, today, he did. Inside the middle drawer was a small notebook. A boring-looking thing, like the kind people used for grocery lists. Peter flipped it open. At first, it was normal stuff. Meeting notes. Reminders to pick up dry cleaning. A phone number labeled Wallace with no context. And then towards the back, there was something that made Peter laugh out loud. It was another list. Things to discuss. Wednesday meeting. Make sure the timeline is realistic. Don't let him back out. Keep everything separate. Peter can't find out. Peter laughed again. Actually, Wheeze laughed. Because what was this? A corporate scandal? An FBI sting operation? What timeline? What couldn't he back out of? And why was she writing all of this down like some kind of buffoon? For a brief moment, Peter wondered if this was some weird multi-level marketing scheme he didn't know about. Was Ruth selling life insurance on the side? Black market Tupperware? He put the notebook back exactly as he found it. The game wasn't over. It was just getting good. Peter wasn't an investigator, but even he knew that if you kept acting like a genius, eventually, you'd run into a fool who left everything out in the open. And Ruth? Ruth was the moron. She didn't even try to cover her tracks. The notebook was already bad enough, but what really made Peter question her entire intelligence was what he found next. Thursday evening, while Ruth was in the shower, Peter walked into her home office. He didn't have a plan. He just wanted to poke around, see if there was more of her brilliantly secured evidence lying around. And, of course, there was. Because Ruth, his very clever wife, had a printed folder sitting right there on the desk. No lock, no hiding spot, no effort whatsoever. Just boldly out in the open, like she wanted someone to find it. Peter sat down and flipped it open. The title on the first page? Divorce Options, Timeline, and Considerations. For a second, he just stared at it, blinking slowly, like maybe his brain needed a reboot. Divorce? Options? Considerations? What timeline? Ruth was planning a divorce, which was news to him. Because normally, when you plan to leave your husband, you don't also plan weekly taco nights with him. You don't discuss new furniture for the living room or ask if he thinks they should switch internet providers. And yet, here they were. Peter flipped through the pages. It wasn't just vague ideas. It was organized, down to specific months. July, discussions with Wallace. August, legal consultation, keep separate from Wallace discussions. September, small test withdrawal from joint account, avoid questions. October, begin quiet separation, Peter unaware. November, announce decision. Peter ran a hand down his face. So, not only was Ruth cheating, not only was she leaving detailed paper trails, but now she was strategizing how to quietly remove him from his own life? Unbelievable. And Darren Wallace, the guy from work, the human oatmeal of men, was somehow involved in all of this. Peter had no idea how, but at this point, he was almost impressed. Not at Ruth. Ruth was a disaster. But Darren? Darren had been flying under the radar this whole time, while Ruth was leaving behind actual documentation of her crime. Peter hadn't even considered Darren capable of keeping a secret. The guy once accidentally emailed an entire company spreadsheet to a client and caused a minor corporate meltdown. And yet, here he was, sneaking around with Peter's wife like some kind of mastermind. Peter closed the folder, put it back exactly as he found it, and walked out of the room. The game was officially ridiculous now. By Friday, Peter was ready for more information. He could have confronted Ruth. He could have demanded answers. But really, what was the fun in that? Instead, he called in a favor. Now, Peter wasn't the type to have contacts or connections, but he did have one useful person in his life, Eric. Eric worked in IT security. He was obnoxiously paranoid about privacy, had at least 6 different encrypted email accounts, and once lectured Peter for 20 minutes about how easy it was to track people using only public data. So Peter called him up. Hey, Peter said casually. Hypothetically, if I wanted to know who my wife's been texting, how illegal is that? Silence. Then, Eric sighed. Peter, I swear to God, if this is about some conspiracy theory you read on the internet. It's about my wife cheating on me and secretly planning a divorce. A pause. Then, a much more interested tone. Oh, well, in that case, go on. Peter explained the list, the notebook, the secret meetings with Wallace, the official divorce planning timeline. By the end of it, Eric was fully invested. This is either the foolest or the most efficient betrayal I've ever heard of, he said, clicking away on his keyboard. Honestly, I respect the commitment to paperwork. So, Peter said, leaning back. What can you do for me? Nothing illegal, Eric said immediately. Okay, fine. What can you do that's ethically flexible? Eric snorted. I can run her name through some databases. See if she's made any big transactions, new accounts, sudden address changes. If she's planning a divorce, she's probably moving money somewhere. Peter grinned. I like where your head's at. Give me a few hours, Eric said. I'll let you know what I find. Peter hung up. And now? Now he waited. Peter didn't consider himself a petty man. Sure, he had opinions about people who parked like morons, and yes, he once spent an entire summer subtly moving a neighbor's lawn gnome a few inches every night just to mess with them, but that was harmless fun. What Ruth was doing, though, that required a very special kind of response. But first, he needed one more piece of confirmation. Because while the list, the weird parking habits, the Wallace meetings, and the divorce planning folder were all deeply incriminating, Peter wanted to be absolutely sure before executing his perfectly crafted, extremely specific revenge. And, lucky for him, Eric came through. At exactly 3:27 p.m., Peter got a message. Bingo. Found a secondary bank account. Opened last year. Very little activity at first, but in the last 4 months, a whole lot of deposits. Also, recent transfer flagged as rent deposit. She's got a place. Peter grinned. A place. So, not only was Ruth planning to divorce him, not only was she seeing Wallace for God knows what kind of romantic nonsense, but now she had a secret apartment somewhere. And she thought she was going to sneak away quietly? Absolutely not. Peter wasn't going to let her get away with that. So, it was time to return the favor. The first thing Peter did was prepare the groundwork. Ruth's meticulously planned timeline was counting on one thing, Peter not knowing a thing until it was too late. So, he made sure she believed that. For the next 2 weeks, Peter acted like the most oblivious husband in the world. He complimented Ruth's cooking. He asked if she wanted to plan a weekend trip. He even, just for fun, casually asked how work was going, watching her try way too hard to look natural while lying to his face. It was beautiful. Meanwhile, Peter got to work. Step 1. Make sure Ruth's secret apartment wasn't actually secret. With a little more help from Eric, who was enjoying this way too much, Peter got the address. It was a tiny, overpriced rental, and Ruth had furnished it herself, which meant she had spent their money pretending to be a responsible adult, all while planning to sneak out like some strategic genius. Peter didn't even have to break in. She hadn't changed the key code from the default. It was like she wanted him to know. So, Peter left her a little surprise. Nothing dramatic. Nothing damaging. Just a perfectly printed out copy of her own divorce planning document, taped neatly to the fridge, with a big smiley face drawn on the last page. Just a subtle little I know. Then, he locked up and left. Step 2. Ensure Ruth's exit wasn't the quiet escape she expected. For the last 5 years, Peter had been the sole account holder on their internet, utilities, and, most importantly, the lease to their house. So, Peter canceled everything. The internet? Gone. The power? Scheduled for shut-off the day after Ruth's planned exit. The lease? Not being renewed. Ruth thought she was going to slowly transition into her new life? Nope. She was getting a full-speed, crash course introduction into it. Step 3. Ruin the Wallace situation, just for fun. Now, Peter didn't know the full details of Wallace's involvement. Was he just a divorce advisor? Was he a secret affair partner? Was he just a weirdly devoted personal assistant in this mess? Didn't matter. Peter wanted to make things inconvenient for both of them. So emailed Wallace's boss an anonymous package containing a detailed, very well-organized letter outlining Wallace's personal involvement in a client's divorce. Screenshots of publicly available records showing financial transfers from Ruth to Wallace's consulting, whatever that meant. A very polite request asking if this kind of employee behavior was something their company encouraged. Peter didn't lie in the letter. He didn't have to. Wallace's career could handle a lot of things, but a formal complaint directly from a client's husband? That was going to become a problem. Step 4. Sit back and enjoy the absolute disaster. Peter didn't have to wait long. Exactly 3 days after he left the surprise in Ruth's apartment, she came home looking like someone had shoved her off a moving train. Peter, she said, very carefully, placing her bag down. We need to talk. Peter smiled. Yeah? About what? Ruth hesitated. Did you go to my apartment? Oh, Peter said, pretending to think. You mean your secret apartment? The one you were going to quietly sneak away to while lying to my face for months. Ruth's entire face twitched. It wasn't like that, eh? Oh, no, I'm sure it was exactly like that, Peter said. Tell me, Ruth, when were you planning to tell me? Before or after the utilities got shut off? Ruth's mouth actually fell open. What? Oh, yeah. Peter shrugged. That's getting turned off soon. And the lease? Also gone. Good luck with that, by the way. I heard breaking a lease last minute is really expensive. Ruth looked physically ill. And hey, Peter continued, cheerfully, if you need financial help, maybe Wallace can help. Oh, wait, never mind. I think he's going to be really busy dealing with that HR complaint I filed. Ruth sat down hard. You figured everything out? Yeah. Peter leaned back. And honestly, I expected better from you. The amount of paperwork you left behind? Embarrassing. If you're going to ruin our marriage, at least do it with some competence. Ruth looked furious. You had no right to. Oh, I had no right? Peter raised an eyebrow. Right. I forgot. You're the victim here. Poor Ruth, having to lie, cheat, and sneak around like a genius mastermind, except you weren't even good at it. Ruth actually looked speechless. And Peter? Peter had never felt better in his entire life. Ruth had never been great at improvising. She could plan, sure, print out schedules, set reminders, send long-winded emails about her monthly goals, but the second something didn't go according to her carefully organized vision, disaster. Which is why Peter wasn't surprised when, after sitting there in horrified silence for a solid 30 seconds, Ruth switched tactics completely. She took a deep breath. Her face changed. The wide, caught red-handed panic melted away, replaced with something softer. Sadder. The exact look she used when trying to get out of a speeding ticket. Peter, she said, her voice so gentle now, like she was suddenly some tragic figure in all this. You have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you. Peter smiled. Not kindly. Oh, this should be good. She swallowed, her eyes shining now either with real emotion or calculated effort. I've been struggling, Peter. For a long time. I've felt Lost. Peter waited. This was going to be hilarious. Ruth sighed, looking down at her hands like she was gathering the strength to open her tortured soul. I didn't know how to tell you, she murmured. I didn't want to burden you with my emotions. You've always been so strong, so Peter clapped his hands once, making her jump. Ruth, cut the act. Her head snapped up. Excuse me. This whole performance, he said, motioning at her like she was a contestant on the world's worst game show. The soft voice, the sad eyes, the deep, tragic suffering that somehow led you to Wallace's car every Wednesday like clockwork? Please. If you actually cared about my feelings, you wouldn't have written your entire escape plan in a notebook and left it lying around like a kindergarten assignment. Ruth flinched. That's not it. And hey, Peter continued, I have to give you credit. The amount of effort it takes to create a secret life while pretending to be the perfect wife? Impressive. Too bad you were absolute garbage at it. She looked like she wanted to throw something at his head. But instead, she doubled down. I was afraid, Peter. Her voice broke, so well-timed it was almost a trained skill. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. I felt like we were growing apart. Peter raised an eyebrow. So, naturally, you decided the best solution was to move out in secret and coordinate with an accountant. She rubbed her temples, exhaling like this was somehow exhausting for her. You're making it sound so simple. It wasn't. It was complicated. Oh, sure, Peter said, nodding. Complicated. So complicated that you, an actual adult with a working phone and direct access to my face every day, couldn't just say, hey, Peter, I'm thinking about a divorce. Let's talk. Instead, you created a full-blown strategy guide like you were planning a military invasion. Ruth pressed a hand to her chest like he'd just accused her of arson. I didn't want to blindside you. Peter let out a genuine laugh. Oh, Ruth, that is exactly what you did. Tell me, were you planning to mail me a copy of your big, I'm leaving, announcement? Or were you just going to vanish like a magician, hoping I'd just assume you were kidnapped? Her jaw tightened. I was trying to protect you. Peter stared at her. He actually took a second to let that sink in. Then, very calmly, he said, you were unbelievable. She softened again, trying another angle. Peter, we had so many good years together. I know you're angry, but can't we just talk? Really talk? Peter tilted his head. Talk about what, Ruth? How you emotionally prepared to leave me 6 months before you even hinted there was a problem. How you meticulously built an escape route, while still asking me to pick up groceries like nothing was wrong. I never wanted things to get this ugly, she whispered. Yeah. Peter folded his arms. Then maybe don't orchestrate a badly executed betrayal and expect it to go smoothly. She bit her lip. No, really, Peter interrupted. Explain it to me. In what reality did you think I was going to happily help you move out, offer to hold the door open while you took half our stuff, and then cheer you on while you ran off into the sunset with Wallace's tax deductions? Ruth had nothing. For the first time in this entire disaster, she actually looked at a loss for words. And Peter wasn't done. You're not sorry you did this, he said. You're sorry you got caught. She looked away. And let's be real, Peter continued, leaning forward slightly. This isn't about love. This isn't about our marriage. This is about the fact that you just realized you're not as smart as you thought you were. Ruth's hands curled into fists. You're being tough. Peter let out a short, sharp laugh. Ruth, you tried to erase me from my own life. And now you're upset that I'm not throwing myself into your arms and telling you I understand. She stood up suddenly, frustrated now. I thought you'd be mature about this. Oh, wow. Peter gave her an actual slow clap. Mature. That's a great word. You know what's not mature? Filing for divorce in secret and playing house in a rental across town while your husband still thinks you're happily married. She exhaled sharply. Peter. No. Peter held up a hand. You know what? You're right. Maybe I should be mature. Maybe I should be more like you. I'll start by writing an entire guide on how to pretend my wife doesn't exist, then leave it lying around like an absolute moron. She grabbed her bag. This conversation isn't getting us anywhere. Oh, it's getting us somewhere, Peter said, standing up too. It's getting me to the end of this nonsense. Because let me be very clear, Ruth, I'm done. Her face twisted, like she wanted to argue, but also knew she had zero footing left. Peter stepped past her, calm and completely unbothered. Take your stuff, Ruth. Go to your little pre-planned escape apartment. Find some new moron to play the emotional victim with. But whatever you do, don't call me when it all falls apart. And just like that, Peter walked out, leaving Ruth standing there. And for the first time in months, Peter felt completely, utterly free. Peter hadn't planned on feeling this good. He expected relief, sure. Maybe a little bitterness. He assumed there would be a few moments where he'd stare at a wall, letting the reality of his failed marriage sink in. But no. Instead, he woke up the next morning, stretched his arms, and realized that for the first time in years, he didn't have to deal with Ruth's never-ending nonsense. No more pretending not to notice the weird tension. No more listening to her overly detailed fake stories about her day. No more being treated like some clueless extra in his own life. He was done. So, the first thing Peter did was clean house, literally and metaphorically. He spent the entire day purging everything that reminded him of Ruth. Deleted her number, not that she was calling, since she was probably too busy figuring out how her carefully scheduled life had exploded. Boxed up every single thing she left behind and dropped it off at her precious escape apartment. No warning, no note, just a simple, efficient goodbye package. Changed the locks, because Peter might be petty, but he wasn't stupid. Went online and updated all his legal documents, removing her from anything that gave her access to his accounts, insurance, or future decision-making abilities. By the time he was done, Peter felt fantastic. And then came the messages. Not from Ruth. Oh, Ruth was radio silent. She was either too proud or too furious to reach out. But her friends? That was another story. First, it was a long-winded email from one of Ruth's work friends, written in the classic, "I'm not picking sides, but here's why you should feel bad for Ruth" style. Peter skimmed it, snorted, and deleted it. Then, there was a voicemail from Ruth's sister, who somehow managed to be even more dramatic than Ruth herself. "She's devastated, Peter," her sister whined. She didn't expect it to happen this way. Peter actually laughed out loud at that one. Didn't expect it to happen this way? Oh, did Ruth expect him to just accept his fate and let her exit like a well-behaved ex-husband-in-waiting? Tough luck. Then came the real masterpiece, a short but frantic text from Wallace himself. "Dude, what did you do? I'm getting investigated at work." Peter grinned. Oh, Wallace. Poor Wallace. He debated answering. But honestly, Wallace didn't deserve a response. So Peter ignored it and got on with his life. By the end of the week, everything was handled. Ruth? Gone. Divorce papers? Filed. Wallace? Suffering the professional consequences of being a complete fool. And Peter? Peter was thriving. He went out with friends, something he hadn't done properly in years because Ruth always had some passive-aggressive excuse about why he shouldn't. He took a few days off work and did absolutely nothing productive, just sat around, watched dumb shows, and let himself enjoy the simple pleasure of not dealing with anyone else's nonsense. And, most importantly, he didn't waste a single second feeling sorry for himself. Because Peter wasn't the fool in this story. Ruth had built her perfect little escape plan, convinced she was the smartest person in the room, and in the end, she had played herself. And Peter? Peter walked away with his peace intact, his dignity untouched, and the absolute certainty that he would never, ever fall for someone like Ruth again. The game was over, and Peter had won. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel